Yeah. Are we on? We're live? Hey, we're live. They tell me we're alive. Let's prove to the people watching online that there's human beings in this room. Let's hear it. We build our brand on live events here at the Row House, getting people in the same room together. So we have to prove that we can still do it despite COVID. Anyway, welcome if you're watching online, and welcome everybody here tonight to the Row House Forum. I am Tom Becker, and I am the founder and director of the Row House Incorporated and curator of these forums. Welcome to the Performing Arts Center here at the Trust. It's a great place to be. And you guys are watching online. When COVID lifts in a few months and we get back to doing live events, we'll look forward to seeing you here in the building. And just come on through. Anybody coming through. We're used to all kinds of fun stuff to deal with. Yeah, we want to see you back live with us. I started the Row House back in 2010 on College Avenue in a row house here in Lancaster City, and I was trying to demonstrate how Christianity makes sense in the world. And the angle that we went at with this was to just have a lot of good food and a lot of good fun and a lot of disruptions and a lot of just craziness in my house. We had some really great talks and great speakers over the years. And then a few years ago, we had the chance to do our events and to grow them a bit here at the Trust. So that's why we're here at the Trust Performing Arts Center. I really started it as a listening exercise for myself and my friends and neighbors and the town, just listening to our culture and listening to it well so we can build a bridge in our culture between faith, what I call the ancient faith, and our current culture. We're celebrating 10 years of this mayhem. It's hard to believe. Someone mentioned earlier one of our concerts. We used to do concerts, and like Josh Garrels, and we had some guys who are Westerners doing East Asian music, Indian music, sitar-based rock and roll. It's a band called Aradhana, and we had flowers and cookies that had tattoos on the hands. It was just very Indian, as best we could make it. It was a great night. It was a great concert. We did some crazy stuff. So we're celebrating 10 years of that and trying to commend faith, Christian faith, in a time where a lot of people are deconstructing faith. Some people are reconstructing it along all kinds of lines. And we're living in this postmodern world. And I won't explain what I mean by that because I don't know. I'll let Charlie Cotherman do that, if he knows what I mean. So tonight's talk is with Charles Cotherman. It's called Francis and Edith Schaeffer, Their Legacy Upon the Academy, Christianity and Culture. He's the author, Charlie is, To Think Christianly, A History of L'Abri, which you'll hear more about L'Abri, Regent College, and the Christian Studies Movement. We have books for those of you who are here tonight. If you're not here tonight, buy one online. It's a great read. It's a great book, well-researched, really well-written. History of very innovative approaches to Christian faith. So if you're here tonight, you want to pick one up, they're downstairs. He has a couple books down there, so pick those up. And he will be glad to sign it. And I would too. Heck, I'll sign the back. I'll sign the back cover. And I just hope that tonight you're inspired by the legacy of the Schaeffers. Whether or not you've heard of them before, some of you have not, which makes sense because we're 30, 40 years out from their major impact. They're very important. But some of you are like me. The Schaeffers had a huge impact on you, and that continues through L'Abri. It's called L'Abri, means the shelter, and it was a hospitality-driven residential study center kind of thing that still exists in England and Switzerland and Holland, places like that. A huge impact on me, and it's the reason we're here tonight. I mean, doing these salons, these lectures, Q&A with coffee. It really is inspired by L'Abri, but also it's inspired by another thing that he touches on in his book. Back in the mid-90s, I was at a place called Covenant Seminary in St. Louis, And they had an arm of the seminary there where I was doing my Master of Divinity, and that arm was called the Francis Schaeffer Institute. And I was heavily involved with that, and I helped to run a conference, the first of its kind, a very innovative conference where we invited innovators in this Christian Study Center movement, this kind of auxiliary Christian outpost ministries that were going on secular campuses. We brought all these divergent people together, and they were a bunch of characters, thinkers, practitioners, entrepreneurs, and to get them in one room and build some commonality, learn from each other. And what came of that was a consortium called the Consortium of Christian Study Centers, which is quite a movement now, 20 years on. And Charlie talks about that in his book as well. But tonight we're going to really focus on the Schaeffers and sort of their impact and who they were as people. And I just cannot wait to hear what he has to say. So before I forget, thank you so much. Don't come up yet. Before I introduce you, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming out. He and his family drove out from Pittsburgh. They've been inside for a year. They haven't done anything. And so this, for them to get out for a weekend in Lancaster, have a few nights on the square, has been a treat for them. They've been busy like you and me, but they haven't really done a trip for a while. So he and his wife, Amy, and 4 little children are here. And we had dinner with them. It was a delight to be with them. But they're enjoying Lancaster. And so now we get to enjoy him. I want you to sit back and relax here tonight, but don't get too comfortable, because I need you to come up with good questions for him. All right? Couple thanks before I actually introduce him. First, to trust, because this black box is great. This venue is amazing. We get to use this for our forums, and we appreciate Rob Bigley and his staff for hosting us. John and Michael are here doing the live stream with Cursive Films. We appreciate them. Cafe 18 supports us with coffee downstairs and some treats, so take advantage of that. And also, the people who are here tonight or online, if you're a member and you give $10 or more a month, you get a journal and you get to come to our events for free and bring a friend. So as we open up again and have more live events, it'll be worth it. And we've had a great year celebrating 10 years. We've had a lot of little boutique events, parties and happy hours and walking tours and stuff. And despite COVID, and we've been out partying, and it's been a great year. So I appreciate everybody in their involvement. One more, our sponsor for our live stream tonight, because we had to invest in this a bit, get some sponsorships, is Bootstrap Local. It's a digital marketing firm specializing in small businesses here locally. And Adam Grimm is right here. He runs it. He's the head honcho over there. And we appreciate Adam and his interest in making this possible. All right. So a little bit about Charles. He lives in Oil City, Pennsylvania, which is near Pittsburgh. It's the area where he and his wife grew up. He worked on his PhD at University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and his book is an outgrowth of that. He's a church planting pastor half-time with Vineyard Church there in Oil City, and then half-time he's working with an institute that's very exciting. I'll let him tell you about it, at Grove City College, which brings this kind of innovation and communitarian work to small towns. And that's speaking my language, because I grew up in a very small town in Pennsylvania. Watsontown, salute. All right. I reached out to Charlie about a year ago when I read his book, gobbled it up, and thankfully we put it in the books, and he was able to come and is gracious enough to drive out here to do this talk. So I think that's about all I want to say. I just want us to welcome him, and want you to think about what he's saying, come up with some good questions, and let's welcome Charlie.
Thank you very much. It is good to be here. Yeah, thanks for bringing that Oil City piece in. Pittsburgh is very generous. I mean, we are about 2 hours from Pittsburgh. I say if you put a dot between Erie and Pittsburgh in the middle of the woods, that is about where I grew up and where we currently live. And I'm kind of proud of it. My wife and I are both from a town called Knox that has 1,200 people. And her dad was my dentist, so it was a small town world we grew up in. So yeah, we're just a little bit about kind of where I feel like to get a talk like this, you got to understand the history, you got to understand the backstory, and a little bit about my history maybe too. Yeah, I have a wife, Amy, 4 kids, 9, 7, 4, and 1, so you can pray for her. Right now she's trying to get them to sleep. Could be a tall task. In 2016, we moved back to where we're from Charlottesville, Virginia. I was a PhD student at the University of Virginia, and I thought I was going on to an academic career, and we just could not escape the call of God. It was clear, and we moved back to plant Oil City Vineyard Church in Oil City, the town that was really next to Titusville, the birthplace of the petroleum industry. It was the headquarters, corporate headquarters of Quaker State Motor Oil till '94 when they moved to Dallas and left us with a lot of mess, really. And so that's kind of the reality we minister in. And we're close to Grove City College, which some of you may have heard about 45 minutes away. So I am part of a team that received a Lilly grant for the Project on Rural Ministry. And so we're trying to think about what does it look like for a liberal arts college, a Christian liberal arts college, to actually invest in the thriving of pastors in small churches around it and use its resources to bless those pastors and churches. And so it's been a great project so far. We're about halfway through. We're learning a lot, and like everything else, we have been adapting to COVID. It has thrown us for a loop, but this next year is looking pretty good. One thing I think that's important to know coming into a talk like this is that I'm at home in evangelicalism. I'm a native speaker of this language. Grew up with books by Francis Schaeffer on the shelves. I'm not sure if my parents read them, but they owned them, and that was half the battle. And they were definitely listening to the radio programs and things like that, where these kind of ideas were trickling out. So when I started studying history, it made a lot of sense to figure out a little more about these figures that I heard about but maybe didn't know a ton about. And I think, I have a mentor who says history is very important. He's a historian, so of course he says that, but it's really true. If you don't understand someone's history, you don't understand a place's history, it's hard to understand that person, that place. The same is true for Schaeffer and for Edith. And by the way, I'm really glad that both of their names made it on the title, because they were a power couple together, and it's hard to even think about it working at L'Abri without the two of them. They really need each other. In fact, I would argue that they are the second most important evangelical couple in the 20th century, at least the second half of the 20th century, the first being Billy and Ruth Graham. Francis and Edith were right behind them in their influence. And so they were really, these are people that if you want to understand American Protestant, conservative Protestantism in the second half of the 20th century, you have to understand the Schaeffers. So, to talk about Schaeffer, though, to put it in context, I think we have to go back a little before them and understand a little bit about what came before. And so this is just kind of like a free aside, but it's really important. Two things I want to point out to lead into our conversation tonight. One, the rise of fundamentalism and the fundamentalist modernist controversy that really kind of became a cultural icon in 25 at the Scopes monkey trial. And suddenly, and about the same time, conservative Protestants lost the seat at the table at places like Princeton Theological Seminary, in the Northern Presbyterian Church, in the Northern Baptist Church. Suddenly they found themselves on the outside looking in to a modernizing Protestantism. And what happened, they were called fundamentalists because there were a series of 12 books printed from like 1910 to 1915 called the Fundamentals that tried to hammer out what's the fundamental aspect of Christianity that we're not willing to give up in a modernizing culture. Virgin birth, second coming of Christ, these kind of things, the substitutionary atonement, the crucifixion. And these fundamentals were paid for by oil tycoons and sent to every English-speaking YMCA leader, pastor, seminarian, professor, you name it. If you were English-speaking involved in church, you got one. And eventually the term fundamentalist came from people who adhered to these fundamentals. But the thing about fundamentalists is, when they lost the seat at the table, they circled the wagons. They started creating a kind of counterculture, separate culture. I mean, this is when the Bible Institute movement took off in the 30s. And there was just a whole separate culture. Think that people had given their money, their time, their whole lives to these mainline denominations, to seminaries like Princeton, and then they didn't have a seat at the table anymore. And they were reinventing themselves. And one of their kind of theological convictions was this idea of separation. You would only work with folks who believed exactly like you. If not, you would separate from them. And so what this ended up in is a lot of schisms. So people like J. Gresham Machen over there at Princeton, he leaves the seminary, he founds Westminster, right? And in 29, and people like the future Boston pastor Harold John Ockengay go to Westminster with Machen, as does a guy named Carl McIntyre. And these two individuals become really important in the lead up to Schaeffer, because what happens is Machen can't even hold it all the movement together. He forms what becomes the Orthodox Presbyterian Church in 36. Well, by 37, when he dies, McIntyre and a group of others form the Bible Presbyterian Church, because the Orthodox Presbyterian Church was okay with like some moderate drinking and things like that. And they're like, no, we're fundamentalists. We're like very much against this. And they form the Bible Presbyterian Church in 37. They also form a new seminary, because Westminster isn't fundamentalist enough. They form Faith Seminary in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, why does this matter about Francis Schaeffer? Well, guess who goes with McIntyre? McIntyre went with Machen to Westminster. Guess who goes with McIntyre to Faith? A young Francis Schaeffer makes the switch from Westminster to the fundamentalist, separatist fundamentalist Faith Seminary in 37. So that's the one thing happening, is Schaeffer is in this Bible Presbyterian Church. I mean, he pastors first in Grove City, so Western PA, Northwestern. You got to say, okay, 3 years there. Then he goes to Chester, PA, so out your way. And then he's out in St. Louis. And that takes him through 48. So from about 38 to 48, Schaeffer's a pastor in a small church. He's a pastor in a multi-staff church in Chester. Then he's the lead pastor in a big church in St. Louis. And one of the things that makes them famous is they design kind of a fundamentalist offshoot for children's ministry that's kind of the fundamentalist version of the evangelical child evangelism fellowship. So they make a fundamentalist version of this that's separate from the evangelical one, because that separatist strand is really a part of Schaeffer's early life. Now, why bring up Ockengay? Well, McIntyre and Ockengay, like I said, left with Machen. They left Princeton Seminary, and they go to Westminster. And Ockengay is willing to kind of be in a mainline denomination, but be an evangelical voice in it. McIntyre writes him off. He sends back the wedding gifts for being in each other's weddings. He's like, no more. We're not gonna do this. Ockengay goes on to become basically the leader of what's called the neo-evangelical movement, the new evangelical movement. He becomes the first founding president of the National Association of Evangelicals in 1942. And then he and a group of young scholars like Carl Henry form Fuller Theological Seminary in 47. And they're trying to be the Caltech of theological seminaries. They're trying to be the best of the best. And really they were. And so with the money and the kind of influence of Charles Fuller, the gospel radio personality, they build up this seminary, and they build up an institution around a new kind of evangelicalism that says we can actually cooperate without compromise. And there's a bunch of like Cambridge evangelicals, people that went during World War II, when you could get into Harvard a little easier because everyone was fighting. These evangelicals got PhDs from Harvard and Boston College and places like that. And so they became kind of like the think tank of the evangelical movement. And they come to Fuller and they converge around Ockengay. And they build up things like Christianity Today in 1956, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in 1969. And who becomes their star? The other most influential voice in 20th century evangelicalism, Billy Graham and his wife Ruth. And he's kind of the figurehead of this. Now this is a long lead into Schaeffer, but it's really important, because what Schaeffer does is he moves away from the fundamentalist camp, and he doesn't move necessarily into the camp that Ockengay made, but he does what they actually couldn't do. And he does it in a way that they never even thought about doing. And here's what I mean by that. The neo-evangelical movement with Ockengay, with Carl Henry, with Billy Graham, they're trying to make evangelicalism respectable again. And they're trying to engage culture. In 1947, Carl Henry writes a book called The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism. And he talks about an example where he goes into a room filled with pastors and he said, how many of you in the last 100 days preached a sermon on any kind of social issue? And no one raises their hand. And And he's like, we have a problem, fundamentalism. And they try to do it, but what happens is they can't. They try to do it with big coalitions like the National Association of Evangelicals. They try to do it through seminaries. They try to do it in all kinds of ways, and they can't. And what happens is it looks just a little bit more intellectual and a little bit more kind of timely, but it still looks the same. It's still fundamentalism, and they're still having a hard time engaging culture. And they're trying all these big ways. I mean, nothing's bigger than Billy Graham. He literally preached to more people in his lifetime than anyone on the face of the planet ever. That's as big as you get. But it still didn't change the culture. Enter Francis and Edith Schaeffer from a little Swiss village, right? And so what I want to do today is ask the question, why? And point out a few of the ways that I think they were extremely influential, and they did what neo-evangelicalism couldn't do, even with big magazines and big seminaries. And yet, they did it from this kind of fundamentalist history that they moved out of to some degree, and they did it with innovation and entrepreneurial thinking, and really, I would say, with the Spirit of God blowing in their sails, right? So here's the thing. When people talk about Schaeffer today, if you pick up a book, now I'm not talking in groups like this, where Schaeffer's probably well loved. I'm talking in historical studies. If you pick up a book on Schaeffer today, here's what you're going to get. You're going to get How Should We Then Live, published in 1976, and Schaeffer talks about abortion. You're going to get C. Everett Koop and Schaeffer publishing Whatever Happened to the Human Race in 79. You're going to get the video documentaries that go with that, and you're going to get his involvement in the abortion pro-life movement, the anti-abortion pro-life movement. You're going to get stories about Randall Terry and Operation Rescue and violence. You're going to get Jerry Falwell and the rise of the religious right. Schaeffer's legacy has largely, outside of a group of dedicated followers, been reduced to his political involvement. Now, on the one hand, you can see why, because that's very important. I mean, if you're talking about the neo-evangelicals wanting to get evangelicals engaged in culture, I mean, civil rights movement comes and they're like, I'm not sure, these are communists, we're not going to get involved. Right? It's after the fact, like, oh yeah, they were right. They were silent. They were not engaged. Schaeffer actually makes abortion a non-Catholic issue, or a more than Catholic issue, an evangelical issue, and gets evangelicals to engage politics. He does what the neo-evangelicals couldn't do or wouldn't do. It's a pretty significant thing. So you see why, but there's a lot that gets overlooked and missed in that history. And so what my book tries to do is tries to say, okay, I'm not going to say that that history is not important and that that's not part of the cultural legacy of Francis and Edith Schaeffer. It certainly is. But there's so much more. And I try to highlight the way in which that works out through real live people in real life places. Now, this book, just to be clear, To Think Christianly is, as the subtitle says, a history of L'Abri, Regent College, and the Christian Studies Center movement. It's not a biography of Schaeffer. It's not strictly a history of L'Abri. So it's showing how L'Abri was part of a wider movement. Okay, so this is, I'm not going to know every single thing there is to know about Schaeffer like an authorized biographer would, but I'm going to know a lot about how this place, L'Abri, shaped a movement that's still growing and still shaping people on university campuses today. So when we talk about that academic piece, there's a lot of that cultural influence that we don't hear about today that Schaeffer and Edith actually helped bring about and catalyze. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about L'Abri. If the Schaeffers did mobilize political action and did do a lot of what evangelicals hoped to do but had failed to do, how did they do it? And it's fascinating. And you guys, some of you know this story very well, some of you may not. But here's what happened. You know, neo-evangelicals, people like Ockenga and Graham, there were some pretty big people writing checks for them. People like J. Howard Pugh, whose family was from northwestern PA, were involved in the oil, they learned all the technology, then they moved to Texas and made bazillions and bazillions of dollars. And Pugh funds Christianity Today. Pew funds Gordon Conwell. Pew's checks fund so much of this. I mean, Schaeffer didn't have a guy like that. He didn't have someone writing these big checks. He didn't build, his influence didn't come from big, huge events. And we might think, oh yeah, we like organic things. We like this, little intimate space. We like these. Yeah, that's us in the 21st century, right? That is not mid-20th century America. Bigger is better, right? We're going to take on atheistic, godless communism by showing them just how big our Christianity can be. We're going to put it on our money, and bigger is better. And at the time where everyone was thinking bigger is better, Billy Graham crusades are the answer, Francis and Edith Schaeffer move to a little town, Weymouth, Switzerland, and set up a house. And in fact, they didn't even go there first. They started as missionaries to children in post-war Europe in 48. So from 48 to 55, they leave the pastorate and they become missionaries, focusing on children in post-war Europe. And yet they built a worldwide influence through small things. Before we had the book Small is Beautiful, Francis and Edith Schaeffer were living it, right? They did it by opening up their hearts, their minds, their homes to the sovereignty of God and the people that He chose to bring to them. In 2008, Os Guinness responded to the Schaeffer's son Frank's book, Crazy for God. Frank has written a number of books. Almost none of them reflect favorably on his parents. So Guinness, who was a close associate and understudy basically of Schaeffer, wrote this article. And in the article, he sums up Schaeffer's ministry by reflecting that he had never met anyone like Schaeffer who, quote, took God so passionately seriously, people so passionately seriously, and truth so passionately seriously. And I think it's this trio of concerns that frames the ministry of Francis and Edith Schaeffer, and it's going to frame the rest of our discussion. We'll see that it was these passions that undergirded the Schaeffers' wider influence in the academy, culture, and Christianity. And the lens we're going to look through to understand it isn't political involvement tonight. It isn't necessarily publishing or documentary videos, but it's a place. It's L'Abri and the communities it influenced. L'Abri was the canvas where the Schaeffers worked out their ideas. I mean, literally, it starts in Edith. Francis has the idea of L'Abri as the shelter, French for the shelter, and Edith starts sketching it out amid the pines, and she writes, like, come for coffee and with your questions. And this was about all they had in 1954, leading into 55. And 55, if you know their story, I mean, they almost get kicked out of Switzerland. It's kind of a miraculous turn of events that they find this house in a Protestant canton as opposed to a Catholic one. And if they hadn't, within a month, they were going to get kicked out of the country, and God provides. And He doesn't just provide, but He provides this amazing chalet on the mountainside. And the views, and I mean, the photos. And I had people that were there send me some photos from back in the day, and then you can get on their website today and see some photos from Swiss L'Abri. It's just unbelievable. It's just gorgeous. And they find this place. And so in 55, they start L'Abri out of their home. And they break ties with the Independent Board of Presbyterian Foreign Missions, which was the fundamentalist, Carl McIntyre-led mission board. So that might sound great. We know their story. It worked out okay for them. But the thing is, that meant they had no funding. All they had was a prayer list. The praying family, as Edith described it. And a prayer list is really good, but it doesn't pay the bills. From the beginning, part of what was going to move L'Abri was the idea that it was going to be a demonstration that God was actually active in the world. A demonstration of the God who is there. And they relied on God. They sent out prayer letters. They never sent out support letters. L'Abri never took out ads for students to come. I mean, can you imagine like a gap year today that never takes out an ad for a student to come, never advertises in any way? That was L'Abri. They were kind of like an original evangelical gap year. And they never advertised for it. They simply trusted that God would bring the people of His choosing. Now, L'Abri kind of came out of the reason it was so raw and so willing to, that Schaeffers were so willing to be open to truth at L'Abri is because it kind of came out of Schaeffer's own spiritual dark night of the soul. In 51, in the winter and spring of 51, he spent the whole months just pacing, rethinking. He says he went back to rethinking his faith from the point of his high school agnosticism and rebuilding it, because he just wasn't sure. The fundamentalist camps he had been a part of were just at each other's throat. They were dividing denominations all the time. He didn't see Christian love, which he would later say was the mark of the Christian, right? He didn't see it. He starts to wonder, like, if we took out all the parts of the Bible to talk about the Spirit of God moving, like, would my faith look any different? And when he rebuilds his faith, it's a faith built on depending on God, who's really active, the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You can imagine Edith, like, in the house wondering what's going to happen, right? If you've ever watched someone walk through deconstruction, it's not always pretty, right? She's in there watching her husband walk through this. Not sure, but he comes out at the end of the day more committed than ever to his faith, more committed to helping people find truth and answer the hard and honest questions that people would bring. And that's the fruit. That hard season is the fruit that and the ground that L'Abri is birthed out of. So what was life like at L'Abri? Well, it depends when you were there. I mean, early on, they really didn't have much. I mean, they were never riding high, but once his book started making some royalties, I mean, he sold 3 million copies of his books in the United States alone. So that kind of started paying for L'Abri over time. But at first, there was a lot of cornflakes and Cheerios. There's stories about Edith actually guarding the fire to make sure they wouldn't put in too much firewood, like burning that coal again, you know? Like, they were really scraping by, trusting that God would provide. But he always did provide enough. It was a place that had different categories of people there. So obviously, it was like a shared home. The Schaeffers were kind of the mother and father figure. They had 4 children of their own. But there were guests who stayed for free. There were workers who were paid. There were students after 1960 in the founding of Farrell House, their kind of in-house study center, where students did a lot of listening to Schaeffer tapes and stuff. Typically, a Farrell House student would work would study in the morning and then work about 4 hours at L'Abri doing projects. William Egger talks about building a stone wall. They would just do things around. So there was a hands-on part to it. There would be evening walks. There would be communal meals. And these meals, people that were there talk about, it's amazing to see the diversity of people that show up at this too. And that's another important thing to think about. I mean, we're talking European, we're talking African, we're talking black, we're talking white, we're talking Americans, and increasingly after the books come out and his tours of America, more Americans come over. But it's a really diverse place. So you can imagine being around a table, hearing all kinds of accents, potentially things being translated. And these tables are set with flowers in the middle. I mean, you have menus, handwritten menus, and Edith in her book, L'Abri, gives us a couple examples of those, and they're really artistically done. I mean, it's not just thrown together, it's not just make-do stuff. They were making do many times. I mean, you have people talk about how many starches they ate, and you gain the L'Abri 10 or 15 because you just ate a lot of bread. But you also hear stories about, man, those were some of the best meals I was ever part of. And we talked. And it was just, we all just sat up in our chairs and we learned how to be at a table, learned how to be cultured. At the same time, we learned about the Lord. Sometimes you learned a little too much. When the prayer would go on long enough, your soup was getting cold. We have stories about that. It would just be like these kind of Genesis to Revelation prayers. There were helpers eventually that stayed on for 6 months. And then there were members, and they really carried the weight of kind of the influence and power at L'Abri. And those were a pretty tight-knit group, often family and really close protégés. Now, one of the things I try to highlight in this book is how L'Abri was a multifaceted community. It was a spiritual community. So prayer, I mean, you can't think about L'Abri without thinking about prayer. We're talking weekly times of prayer. We're talking just spontaneous times of prayer. We're talking yearly times of fasting. Prayer was a huge part of life. I mean, if you have to depend on God, I mean, this is like Mueller's orphanage on some level. If you have to depend on God, prayer has to be part of it. And they were praying that God would demonstrate he was there and he was acting. They were praying that he would send the people of his own choosing. I mean, they're not taking out ads, like I said. But what this means is that they acted as if the sovereignty of God was directing the events at L'Abri and who even showed up. So if you think that person that comes and is standing in front of you is sent there directly by God, do you think you act a little different? Yeah. They acted as if everyone that was there, by and large, was someone that God wanted there. And it gave them an intense seriousness about meeting people where they were. And you hear these stories about folks saying, like, I was nobody from nowhere. Sure, they had the rock stars of evangelical come in, and literal rock stars like Larry Norman, and they had rock stars of the counterculture like Timothy Leary come in. They had these big name folks. Billy Graham was there, and George Bush Sr.'s mom was there. I mean, they had people there, but they had average people from like nowheresville, Midwestern towns. And yet they invested in them. There was one woman who wrote a book about it, Linda Mercandante, and she talks about how even after she left, they're writing to her asking when a family member's sick, how are they doing? I mean, she's like no one from nowhere. She comes to know the Lord there, and even after she leaves, they're still, and you can find these letters. You have to go down to Eastern Baptist Seminary and get in the archives and have the archivist, who's like the most intense archivist I've ever met, look over your shoulder the whole time. If you write too many notes, he tells you you're writing too many. And you have to ask permission from the Schaeffer family to publish them. It's pretty intense, so just be on your guard if you're going to do that. But they're there, and you can find these letters, and it's just amazing to read through them. So it was a spiritual community. They took God passionately seriously, as Guinness said. But it was also an intellectual community. They took truth passionately seriously. If there was something that Schaeffer really kind of came to be known for, it was a search for reality, a search for truth. An emphasis that there was true truth that you could find. That it wasn't just a kind of crapshoot and, your opinion and my opinion go together, and whichever one gains more of the mass opinion is right. That was exactly what Schaeffer stood against. There was absolute truth, and it was found in the Trinity, it was found in the triune God, and in His Word. So one of the first ways that L'Abri became well known was through a Time magazine article. Someone at Time had a daughter who was friends with someone who was at L'Abri, and they hear about it and they write, and it's called Mission to the Intellectuals, and it's published in Time in 1960 when almost no evangelicals in America knew about Schaeffer. And it calls him it describes him as this kind of almost like hipster, before hipster was a thing, this countercultural entrepreneur that they couldn't really describe. I mean, he's using words he's saying things like evangelicalism is bourgeois, right? They're like, what? Who is this guy? In 1960, right? And it's an interesting thing to think about without going to Europe, which, by the way, they thought was kind of the end, not the beginning of their influence in America. Without going to Europe, they talk about it as feeling like a grain of wheat buried. But then eventually, God kind of shone the light of the sun on it and it sprouted. Without going to Europe, Schaeffer would not have thought the same way. Sure, he would have gone to museums. He always cared about that. He would have cared about truth. But it was being in Europe. He was ahead of the curve. He was dealing with existentialism over there way before it was really, popular in American culture. And so Schaeffer is encountering these things through the college students that come and their coursework, and as he has these conversations, and so he's able to be kind of avant-garde in the issues, at least, that he tackles, even if he's very orthodox in the way he tackles them. So it was an intellectual community. And what happened is, by simply saying, in almost a Kuyperian way, that, Jesus, like Abraham Kuyper, the Danish prime minister, journalist, theologian, who said, basically to paraphrase, Jesus looks out at creation and says, mine, that everything's his. Schaeffer kind of showed us what that looked like in the 20th century. What does it look like to integrate your faith with every aspect of your thinking and your life? And this is what was so fascinatingly contagious for young evangelicals that hadn't experienced this. I mean, you mean you can talk about these movies? You mean you can actually, places like Wheaton, you weren't allowed to even go to movies, right? You can talk about these movies. You can talk about this art. You can go into an art gallery and actually have something meaningful to say. You're not just looking at that one head of Jesus on the wall that like every evangelical church had, you know? My church had it. Your church might have had it. You know the one, right? It was amazing. He was a door opener. But the other thing is, it wasn't just an intellectual community or spiritual community. It was a hospitable community. They did it in a way no one had thought of. They opened up their home. He says in 3 years, all their wedding presents were like toast. They were gone. They had holes in their sheets from people smoking in the bed. But they opened up their home. In fact, it got them, in the Independent Board of Presbyterian Foreign Missions, when they started opening up their home for these conversations, they said, we don't think this is actually mission. And they cut their salary before they even quit. It wasn't sexy at all. Like now, like hospitality is like, oh, kind of like a catchphrase. It was not like that, and they were doing it. And the last thing I think, and this is something I try to highlight in this book, is that L'Abri wasn't just a spiritual community or an intellectual community or hospitable community with nice flowers and, you know, a almost guru-esque leader and his wife who was just the epitome of fashion and style and culture. It wasn't just a place where you could ask the hard questions that haunted you and find friendship. And if you showed up with nothing to wear, go to get the clothes out of the back. It was a place that inspired your imagination for what could be, right? As you sat there next to like, you know, maybe a president's son or a vice president's son or someone from Africa or someone from the UK, and you're maybe from middle of nowhere, Nebraska, and you're sitting next to like Bill Edgars, you know, who's Harvard cosmopolitan musicologist. I mean, you probably didn't have a single friend who was from an Ivy League school. And then you show up at L'Abri and suddenly some of your best friends in the world went to Yale and Harvard. It changes the way you thought about what was possible. And suddenly art, you know how to think about it. So if you actually start rising up the scale and social status and you go to that art museum with your company, guess what? You know what to say. It prepared evangelicals who were about to move into a cultural mainstream for that, but it didn't just prepare them for this kind of climbing the social ladder, which it did, though, prepare them for. Michael Lindsay, in 2000, and I think it was 7 or 8, writes a book called Faith in the Halls of Power, and he interviews like 250 evangelical CEOs, and what's he find? That more of them are connected to Schaeffer and his books and his work and L'Abri. It's like 15% of them say that Schaeffer was one of those who influenced them than almost anywhere else. It created a network of people who really wanted to engage the world with their minds and their hearts. But it also created a group of people that said, I want to go do this. I want to love God with everything in every area of my life. I want to be an artist. I want to be an intellectual. There's a vocational revolution, one historian talks about, that happens from people that spend time at L'Abri, right? So many evangelical theologians and historians and artists of a certain age, this was the place where they got their spark, right? And it wasn't just that. For some of them, the aspiration was, and I want to recreate this in my place. And that's what the rest of my book basically highlights, are folks like R.C. Sproul, who meets up with Schaeffer at Lookout Mountain, Tennessee in 1971 and says, like, they have like a 3-hour-long meeting in the president's house. And he comes back, and that same year he starts the Ligonier Valley Study Center. And that leads into Ligonier Ministries and the wide influence that had. Or someone like Bayat Steiner, who writes to Schaeffer from the University of Virginia, where he's become a Christian, and starts a conversation with him, is reading his books. He spends time at L'Abri. He also goes out to Regent College in Vancouver and becomes kind of a protege of James Houston, the principal at Vancouver, at Regent in Vancouver. Bayat comes back to the University of Virginia, and he starts a study center, the Center for Christian Study, that ends up modeling itself kind of on this dual emphasis of L'Abri and Regent. Because if there's one thing that you need to know about L'Abri, is it was a shelter in the best way and maybe the worst way, right? It was a shelter where you could ask hard questions and be safe, but it was also a place that wasn't as connected to the academy as it could have been. There are stories about Schaeffer, and this is one of the things I highlight in the book, and you know, no one's history is perfect. One of the things Schaeffer had a hard time doing is actually working among equals. He was really good at being in charge and being the smartest person in the room. But when Richard Mao, who became a very well-known evangelical theologian, or George Marsden wanted to lead a group of students from Calvin College to L'Abri, Schaeffer said, students can come, but you can't, because it might be complicated, right? And his friend James Houston, who was an Oxford-trained geographer, and he became the first principal of Regent College in Vancouver, which itself has a fascinating story, which I detail in this book. Houston, for years and years, asked Schaeffer to come to Regent. And Schaeffer was too busy, didn't do it, to deliver an address at graduation. And finally, in 75, he does. And they're sitting there at breakfast, Rita and Jim Houston and Francis and Edith Schaeffer, and they're having this conversation, kind of heart to heart. And Houston raises this idea that you might be too isolated out there. This is in 75. This is right before How Should We Then Live? And Schaeffer even bolts into more celebrity, right? He says, and he writes him a letter afterward, within the body of Christ we need each other and the way in which others can cross-fertilize or indeed correct our own perspective. And certainly in this day of highly specialized skills to help each other in specialties that are not our own. L'Abri has been your strength, Houston goes on to say. Please don't let it be a source of weakness because it became too much of a ghetto of thought. It's a shelter for those from outside, but don't let it be a ghetto from the thought that comes from within. Schaeffer writes back, I realize the danger, but really, Jim, I think that either you or someone who's giving you this impression have really missed the actual situation. I'm really anything but isolated. Endless theologians and other thinkers come here to talk with me. And on top of that, in my time away lecturing, I have long conversations with almost the whole spectrum of theological and intellectual thought. Of course, none of us can have too much inner conflict, but I don't think the possible danger in my case is realized. For example, in this new book and film which I'm working on, How Should We Then Live? We've had about 10 competent researchers in every possible area not only check my work, but make input into it. And that was the last letter they wrote to each other. That was the end. Houston pushed a little bit on Schaeffer's isolation, the fact that he basically surrounded himself with protégés and wasn't involved in any way that could actually critique him with any authority structure. And it ended. And right after that, following the lead of, at least by Frankie's telling of his son, he heads off into this film venture that receives a very different review from certain corners of the evangelical world. And this is where his influence starts to divide. And this is where the political thing comes in. And you just wonder, at least I wonder, had that conversation gone a little differently? Had that conversation continued? Schaeffer's influence might even have been deeper and wider. I'm not sure. So a couple takeaways, and then we'll open up for questions. When I think about Schaeffer's legacy, I think about a few things. I think about integration. All of life is under the authority of Christ. That means culture, mind, beauty, truth, goodness. That means our politics are too. And you can see how a movement that was an anti-abortion movement could come from this kind of theology, right? I also think of the importance of home-based hospitality. The Schaeffers put hospitality on the map in a brand new way. And around their dinner tables and their coffee tables and on their porches, people came to know the Lord. And they came away empowered for a life of meaningful engagement with all kinds of different spheres of society. I think of a combination of deep spirituality with keen appreciation for truth and intellect. And when those things get combined, it's pretty powerful. I think about their emphasis on the sovereignty of God, that there really are no little people and no little places. I mean, who would have thought that when we name the top 5 most influential people within 20th century American evangelicalism, one of them comes, or 2 of them, if you count Edith, come from a little Swiss village. And lastly, positively, I think he left a legacy of people. Things like this, right? The row house. This is part of that legacy. People who caught the vision and brought others along. Say, come look at this. Look at this God who actually cares about all of life and has something to say about it, and who speaks truly, and who's dependable. It's pretty amazing. But it's also, you see in it, some things to be cautious about. The isolation. Being in a potential echo chamber, right? The shelter could become a ghetto. We evangelicals, and I say we because I consider myself one, are pretty good at building our own cultures and our own worlds and our own ministries. Like, just look at the history of 20th century evangelicalism in the way like nepotism, and you get the position just because you're someone's son or whatever, has influenced it for bad, right? And maybe that's all part of a larger thing. Celebrity culture has been a part of evangelicalism since its birth. George Whitefield was the first celebrity, the evangelist in the early 1700s. In the colonies, he was second only to potentially King George in fame. So we evangelicals have from the beginning been really good at making celebrities and expecting more than they could deliver out of them. And celebrity culture, the price of success can be pretty high. You know, even think about what we're driven to, more and more in the audience. Schaeffer was inherently a small is beautiful kind of person. But then came video. And then it moved out of his living room, and it moved into 5,000 person lecture halls watching movies. The media shaped the message, and there was a price of success. In 1969, Edith writes to her praying family, and she says, we kind of realize now that there's not going to be an off season at L'Abri anymore. We're going to be full all the time. And by 73, they move out. They can't have a shared home. She says it doesn't feel like a shared home anymore. It feels like a hostel, right? It feels like we're constantly getting our picture taken and everyone's running up to us. We can't even live our lives. They're running up to us with questions. And suddenly they were something to be consumed rather than someone to live life with. They were kind of victims of their own success. The question I think about as someone in ministry, as someone that wants to have as significant a life as I can have in the Lord's wisdom, it's like, how do you surround yourself with people that can help keep you from being a victim of your own success? Right? It's a good question for all of us in whatever realm of influence we have. So did they influence the academy? Well, not directly, but indirectly through a legacy of people and through a legacy of study centers, which I hardly touched on tonight, which is actually the topic of this book. So you should get it and read it if you want to know that. The way that Schaeffer's thought is still impacting college campuses, places like Yale and Cornell and UVA and Berkeley and the University of Florida. Notice I didn't say many small rural colleges there, so that's a growing edge if any of you feel called to do that. But just saying, the legacy lives on. All right, I'm going to stop talking, take questions.
Let's hear it. Thank you, Charlie, so much. Are we good? Are we good here with sound? Are we all right? All right. Thank you so much. Again, that was really stirring. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask you a question. I have one online here. So if you're watching on YouTube live, just type them in the chat box there. We have one. What we've typically done is I'll lead with a question, and we'll take one from the room, and then we'll take one from online, and we'll do that for 20, 30 minutes.
Sounds good.
Till we start to get uncomfortable up here, or you do, and then we'll close it down. But yeah, thank you so much. That was really, really thoughtful and a good, succinct way to introduce us or reintroduce us to the Schaeffers, and I appreciated that. Wow, I had a lot to think about here. So I was curious about, in my own story, wanting to do something inspired by L'Abri. I did find along the way that people who tried to replicate L'Abri kind of didn't work. Because it was a special time, special people. They both had 24-hour energy, especially Edith, I guess.
Especially Edith, yes.
And you just can't do that. So in my case, I was lucky enough or blessed enough to do the row house and kind of realize, okay, there's certain components we can do. there's other things in our culture and our time we can work with those currents. So what do you think, how could people implement, or have you seen examples of people implementing L'Abri, doing something close to it? What wisdom would you give to someone who thinks, well, that sounds so great, let's do it?
Start small. I would say start small, because you cannot recreate this really, like you said. I mean, there was a certain sense in which Francis and Edith are just inimitable. I mean, you can't imitate them.
Yeah.
And literally, Edith, her energy, like that's why so many women that were mentored by her crashed and burned, because they couldn't keep up. They couldn't be Edith, right? Whereas Schaeffer at least seemed more human, right, in some way. But I think about it. They didn't just start with this huge international ministry. They didn't start with this big media push, and then they had 100 people, and then they had to figure out what to do. It was like, oh, you have a friend from college? Have them come over for the weekend. Organic growth, right?
Yeah.
And even there, I would say there's a caution that it might not be sustainable in most circumstances, because, so R.C. Sproul, Ligonier Valley Study Center, most of the study centers I treat in this book had a kind of dual Regent and L'Abri emphasis. But from the beginning, R.C. Sproul's was really more, pretty much exclusively L'Abri. And what happens is, about 5 years in, they change. They change completely, because they're burning their host families out. Their families are trying to raise kids, cook dinner for 10 people every other night, and their families are like, we can't do this anymore. You know, and so they had to completely switch their ministry.
They pivoted to video.
That's right.
And the rest is history. The row house is pivoting to online media. Wait, I'm going to follow up my own question, because when you say that, like starting small, and Becky and I can attest to that, you're just faithful where you are, and things can begin to grow over time. It's true of a business. It's true of lots of things. My concern today is you can start thinking you're bigger than you are because of social media.
Yeah.
So everybody wants to be an influencer. They want to get online. You might get 500 followers. Wow. Could you speak into that? Like someone wants to have an influence, but they've got this social media thing hanging over them. What can you do?
It is something that I even wrestle with. I mean, you start a church, like you want to get the word out. You want people to come. You write a book. You want people to read it. You want people to buy it. You want what you put your life into to matter, right? To more people than just your family, you know? At the same time, this self-promotion thing, this promotion angle, even if it's not self, like Schaeffer really, I mean, he would talk a lot about his books in his letters. Like you come up with almost every letter talks about his next book, but he didn't do it publicly, but he had promotion people after a little bit. And so like living up to the promo on the dust jacket was actually pretty tough.
Yeah.
Because, you know, and so I think this, if you want to call it spin or you want to call it PR, we have to be, I think the gospel actually trains us to be wary of that.
Yeah.
You know, because it can get ahead of you. You know, and so I think part of it is having kind of a really cautious, almost hermeneutic of suspicion to the way in which we're all inclined to promotion, and we're inclined, you know, and I mean, what if we did pray every day? I think about this. God, send the people of your choosing to Oil City Vineyard. God, let this be a demonstration of your power. It's not going to be through Facebook or for Twitter.
Yeah.
You know, and something to think about.
Yeah, it sounds like you're wrestling with it. That's good. I have more, but anybody in the room here have a question? Please just raise your hand and don't be bashful. You can speak it out and then I'll restate it, make sure the audio comes through. Yeah.
So the impression you get is L'Abri was kind of like a place for common ground, yet Schaeffer, as an apologist, was the, you know, presuppositionalist, where it's like it's this way, period. The way we defend the faith. And so how was he able to do that and still create an environment where people felt like common ground is welcome, we explore, and yet he's entertaining that, and yet where he held. How did he do that?
Yeah, I think part of it was a gift of God on him, like that he just, especially in person. Writing, it doesn't come across the same way, but when you were with Schaeffer, like the light bulb turned on in a way that didn't reading his book. And some of that's because he would literally spend hours with the person if he needed to, and just go back and forth. And even someone like Eggers talks about how he could pinpoint. He'd show up at Harvard, and these students would ask really tough questions. And Eggers was kind of a fan and a supporter by that point. And he's a student, and he's like, oh, he's never going to get this one. And he's like, but he put his finger on the weakness in that person's argument. There was like one spot, and he got it. And that's where I think it was a gift of God, like a wisdom. And I think it was just, most people would say he was brilliant, but it wasn't in a kind of standard academic sense, but he was just able to recall things, but I think it was also that personal care. Like, people felt like they were loved, when you had a conversation, when you're sitting around that fireplace. No question was like written off.
So the idea is he knew his method. You mentioned presuppositionalism, so his approach to defending Christian faith had a certain way that he did it. But you're saying his manner in the context and the time.
Yeah. I'm not saying he was wishy-washy in any way. He knew what he believed, and he believed it was true, and he was going to advocate for that.
Is there any evidence that he was teachable in moments like that?
That's a good question, and there's not a heck of a lot of it. There are once or twice you come across, like he said, like, I'm going to think of. That's one I need to think about. So at least you have that. It's it's not. You don't get in these conversations a sense of arrogance coming through. By and large, but he was confident.
Okay. Keep percolating out there. We have several people in the room who have actually been to a L'Abri. So I expect high things.
That's right.
Whoever you are out there,
I can give you my chair if you want.
Yeah. No, we don't do it that way. We're paying you the big bucks.
All right.
So online here, this is from Eric, longtime fan of the Row House and several times speaker. Hi, Eric. He says C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer were both intellectually huge influences within orthodoxy. So they were not neo-orthodox or liberal, or they had this particular set of commitments. But how were they different? Well, how were they similar in their approach to modern times? How were they different?
And there is, I do think they went for a walk together at one point before Lewis died, but we don't have a lot.
That's a children's book in the making.
Yeah, right. So what's fascinating is how they've aged so differently. Yeah. Like, we might not pick up, maybe you do, I don't know, but most people I know don't pick up their Francis Schaeffer books and just read them all the time anymore. But we still do Lewis, right? So the way Lewis has aged has been way, way better. And I don't think it's simply because Schaeffer got identified with a political right. That might be part of it, but I think it also has to do with the fact that Schaeffer's books were talks that were then edited, and Lewis was like one of the best prose English writers that we've ever seen. So there's that too. Right. But if you read, Schaeffer's books were so rooted in their moment, whereas kind of like the title of Mere Christianity, it was almost timeless, right, in a different way.
Yeah, add fiction to that.
Right, and then you add fiction, sure.
Sure. Yeah, in the room here. Yeah.
Dr. Schaeffer was so relational. Did he ever express regret with, the later portion of his life, with his involvement with the media and his film series? Then a second question, I don't know if this can be answered, but Frankie Schaeffer's life arc, reaction.
Can you restate it, Charlie?
Yeah. So the first question was, did Schaeffer ever express any regret at the end of his life for kind of the turn he took toward the end? And the second was to kind of comment on Frank Schaeffer's, the arc of his life, and was it a reaction to his parents' ministry? The first question is, to my knowledge, no. I think Schaeffer, by and large, while people talk about like multiple Schaeffers, I think I can see that as being true that there was like the fundamentalist separatists, and then there was like the European avant-garde intellectual, and then there was the return to America and the conversations of fundamentalism that happened there. I can see that, but I think there's also a lot of people that were close to them also say, hey, it's like Schaeffer always believed in inerrancy, and he was always going to say that. It's just the way it came out in like the great evangelical disaster at his last year of his life was like more strident. So I don't think he saw it the way I described it, that there was kind of a downturn at the end. I think he saw it as the actual living out of what he believed. And honestly, it is hard. It is hard in the midst of it, right, to argue with the success that comes with numbers and with greater influence, and you're meeting presidents and things like that. It's hard to argue with that, right? Who says no to that? Not many. And so his sons, I did not call Frank Schaeffer when I was writing this book. I decided this was the one family I just kind of let their story be theirs and kind of gleaned it from letters. All the other people I did get to in this book, but there's a lot of baggage there. And I just thought I'd let that, it's been expressed in multiple ways already. And if it's not reaction, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, online here, we had a question from Nelson. What might Schaeffer say to evangelicals today, particularly to the myth or this understanding of a Christian America, Christian nation? What might he say to that?
Well, on that issue, I'm a little concerned at what he would say, because he was a little bit too forward on the idea of a Christian nation back when he was alive, before it was really as big as it is today. And Christian nationalism, obviously a major thing evangelicalism is dealing with right now. Historians like Mark Knoll took him to task over this during his life. So I do wonder what he would say to that. I don't know. What I do think we could say pretty clearly is he would still be about the authority of Scripture. And these conversations that seem to basically come down to my experience tells me this, or like 51% of my denominations voted this is okay now. Like Schaeffer would not be in that camp. Like there would be a true truth, and he would be advocating for it.
Yeah, let's go back to the room here. Don't be bashful. Don't be shy. Yeah.
I have a really silly question, but when did the knickers become a thing?
She asked, when did the knickers become a thing? And she doesn't mean the Knickerbockers from New York. She means some of the avant-garde attire of Francis Schaeffer.
Right.
Good question. Very good.
I don't know the exact date, but by the mid-'60s they were there, right? In 55, when Labrie started, they weren't. So at some point in that decade, Schaeffer decided, I'm going to grow a goatee, grow out my hair, and look a little more countercultural. And he inspired, this is an aspiration too. A lot of his proteges started dressing and wearing their hair the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some people who do the chin beard and do the thing, and they're into Schaeffer. It makes me chuckle. That was a good question. Yeah.
What would you recommend a Schaeffer book today that be most appropriate or time for our time?
Yeah, appropriate book or recommended book by Schaeffer for our time.
Yeah. How Should We Then Live is probably one of his best books. It's not perfect, and people that are specialists in some of the philosophical things more than I am point those things out. It's kind of one of those things, unless you're a specialist in some of these things, it sounds pretty coherent. And then you hear a specialist talk about, like, oh, maybe there's more there that I didn't know. But still, I think that, or the first trilogy, The God Who's There, Escape from Reason, those books are those are some of his more timeless ones.
Yeah, my story is, I was a new Christian, evangelical, at a secular college. So here I am reading The God Who Was There, and it just, buttressed me. It made me feel like, yeah, it's a reasonable faith, and I credit him for getting me through and not losing my faith. So It was huge, and I think that could be helpful to somebody today.
Yeah, I think so. And honestly, that was what happened. If you were kind of one of those kids in your church youth group or in a campus ministry that people said, this person seems to have a good head on his or her shoulders, and they really seemed, you know what you got? You got C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer at a certain era, from the IVP book stand is where, and that really shaped a lot of people.
No, it doesn't answer everything, and I'm just thinking about our current generation. I have kids that are Gen Z and millennials, and we're dealing more with, and this shows up in the L'Abri crowd that comes to L'Abri, less from maybe intellectually pursuant young people, but tilting more toward emotionally aware, emotionally damaged, psychological issues coming to the fore. And so I'm wondering, as you look at what young people need today, would they need someone like a Schaeffer, Edith and Francis, or do they need something a little different? And are they getting something different? Is there a place young people can go? There are mentors out there that you would recommend are doing similar work, similar effect, but aware of the cultural horizons of our time?
Yeah, I think there's a few answers to that, and I don't know, none of them are exhaustive, but I think the trickle down from people like Schaeffer has influenced not every church, but definitely some. And so you can find youth ministries and churches where people have kind of come to think about this stuff, and they can meet students where they're at today. I think also places like study centers, like the Center for Christian Study at UVA, they have counselors, they have Bible studies, but they have courses. So I sat in on one when I was doing this research, and I was living in Charlottesville, and it was science in the Bible, right? And we had everyone from young earthers there to the head of the campus atheist and agnostic club. And it was really robust, So I think some of the study centers in some of these highly fraught university communities are doing this stuff too, and the legacy carries on. And I also think about, I've just pretty much finished reading Carl Trueman's new book, The Rise of the Modern Self. And I think about that book, and I've been thinking about it in relation to these books by Schaeffer, where you have this hundreds year long arc, and you're tracing it out to point out something that's modern. And so I think books like that still kind of, in some way, even if it's coming from within an academic spot, in Trueman's case, still kind of tap into this, I want to understand how we got here.
Right. The brokenness of self and the world and others. That's good stuff. And he's been recommended to us, so maybe we'll get him out here sometime.
Grove City College.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I stumbled upon an interview years ago, but it's still very alive in my mind. I knew Frankie Schaeffer was somewhat critical of his father. So it's an NPR interview. I can't remember who the interviewer was, but it was an afternoon show. And they went on for a good half hour. And Frankie never said anything disparaging about his father.
Yeah.
But he did say that he suffered grinding depression.
Francis.
Yeah, yes, really, really bad. Enough that if it's bad enough, you kind of want out. And he said to his son, he said, Frankie, he goes, I'd love to do that, but I would never do that to you. And that really struck me. And I've never had a clinical depression to know how bad or how dark that is, but Frankie described his father as really having that. I don't remember exactly what the time frame was, how close to the end or anything, but and then the thing they talked about most was the political involvements. And in Frankie's opinion, he was used quite a bit, and it was believable to me.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's something that's, I don't know if we need to summarize that for the camera, but just basically, we had a comment about an interview Frank Schaeffer did on NPR years back, talking about his father and his struggle with clinical depression, and then his political involvement, and Frank kind of asserting that Schaeffer was used, which I think I don't deny that in some ways that he probably was used, but he also was a wise person in a lot of ways who could probably, fend for himself to some degree too, right? Now, if you read Crazy for God, Frank basically takes the blame on himself, he basically tells his dad, we gotta expletive, do something about this, right? And so some historians are saying, I'm not willing to believe that Frankie actually had that much influence, but then others will kind of read it and psychologize and said, well, if you know your son's been running around with no parental oversight for years and you kind of feel bad about it, maybe you would, And there's something here too that I take to heart personally about how our ministry involvement shapes our families. So it's interesting, Frankie basically says if you ask my parents at any point in time, they have no idea where I was all day, and he's just running around with all these like beautiful 20-year-old college students around him, right? Before they got the Liberty 15 or whatever, but he's there, and it does. These fictional books he writes that are thinly veiled attacks at his family, like they're pretty disturbing, and the things they raise, and so there's something going on in Frank's life that it's hard to pin down, but it does make you think as someone in ministry, like, how do I do this in such a way that my family thrives? Because who else is at L'Abri? Harold Ockengay's son. He sends him to L'Abri because he's on the edge of like drugs and all this, and Schaeffer writes him a letter and he says, you need to come back so you don't go the way your sisters have gone. So you have the guy leading evangelicalism as the statesman whose son has to go to L'Abri to kind of try to figure it out, and actually we're not sure he even does, right? So it's there's a lot of like mentality of I'll give everything to this ministry at this point in life, and sometimes that means your family too.
Yeah, we just got back from English L'Abri last January, and we can see how over time they've worked out boundaries. The family life is really valued, and it's still going to be tough. But I think they've learned over the years, and they've tried to keep their lives permeable enough for the students that it helps them, but also to maintain their own family order. But it's messy business. I think even with the row house, I'm trying to do this public thing that's engaging culture, and not just for Christians and the public. And it's messy. The people you meet, the people that come and go, the heartache you feel. It's not an easy cookie cutter. Check it off. This great results. It's a very messy business, and having been there, it's not squeaky clean. The people who are there working, people who come, but there's a beauty in it. But yeah, and do we have any more from the room here? I'd love to. Yeah.
Is there a modern day equivalent in the church to Francis Schaeffer today?
I'd be interested to hear what you think on this one, Tom. I don't know of one that comes to mind readily. Now, like I said, that book by Carl Trueman does some of the things that Schaeffer's book did by it helps me understand, like, how do we get where we're at today by taking this kind of look at art and philosophy and, like, weaving this story through, like, 400 or 500 years. So that book reminds me of this, but is there someone that's doing this exactly? I don't know.
Someone who's doing something like Schaeffer. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is people doing small things that aren't necessarily sexy or getting a lot of celebrity power. It's not the celebrity power pastors per se, but it's the smaller people doing smaller works, I would imagine, and normal things. There are people in the media and the arts, partly thanks to Schaeffer, who are just quietly writing scripts, working with cameras, involved in Hollywood, places like that, telling stories. So that could be a place to look. But we need champions. We need examples for sure. Not to replicate what the Schaeffers did, but to live out what they were trying to live.
Yeah, and I think we also have to just say, like, there are just some people that God just wires in a way that's so suited to their time that they just hit it out of the ballpark by living into what God's wired them to do.
Yeah.
And we just say, thank you, God.
And they're usually pretty obscure and wacko for a while.
Yeah, maybe for a long time.
Yeah, really. And those people are people we don't talk about because we don't know who they are, where they are, in some corner somewhere, which is fine. We need to be faithful where we're at, but good, thoughtful question. Do you have any ideas? No?
Here's one thing, no one saw Schaeffer coming.
Right.
So, person might be out there, or hopefully it's a team. It's a group. That'd be a little better than a person.
There's a movement through Comment magazine, the journal, I learned about through a group called Breaking Ground. Ann Snyder is a part of Breaking Ground. She's coming to speak in September. And she's the editor of Comment magazine. Anyway, she put out a video about people in America trying to find common ground and really listening to each other politically. It is profound. I forget what it was called, but it was very moving. And I think there's some really cool movement amongst upcoming generations trying to actually have cross-party dialogue as independents, but maybe also as party people, and really have building relationships just for the social, political fabric of our country. That's a good sign. Those things are happening, and we need to pump them up.
Yep.
So be on the lookout for that. I don't see any online. I don't see any hands, but this is your last chance, people in the audience. I want to see those hands come up. Just think about a Billy Graham rally just for just a moment.
That's right. Come to the front.
I hate those dumb evangelical jokes, but I use them.
That spurs a question in my head about Billy Graham. Several years ago, I read his autobiography called Just As I Am, and then knowing about Schaeffer and reading him and just being a huge fan with a very small f, just kind of contrasting both men and their journeys, their faith journeys were very, very different. So, yeah, maybe you could just comment on what you know about each of them, like compare and contrast.
Yeah.
Comparing Schaeffer and Billy Graham.
Yeah, well, I mean, on some level, it's like completely different, right? Because it's as big as you can get. And on another level, you know, in Schaeffer's, it's small, 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 small for so long. And yet at the same time, they're both writing these books that are widely read. They're both preaching a, you know, biblical, evangelical, basic, you know, you need a savior kind of message, even though Schaeffer's had a lot more complexity to it, obviously. And that was important, right? It wasn't, you know, it was one of those things, you might go from Billy Graham to Schaeffer, but you probably didn't go from Schaeffer to Billy Graham, right? Just like you might go from Labrie to Regent, because it has a more like institutional academic heft, right? Or Covenant, or somewhere like that. But I think something that is worth saying is like the fact that neither of them are tainted really by scandal, even with you know, a son like Frank who has muddied the water a heck of a lot. I mean, in a world that we live in today, for an internationally known figure not to be tainted by scandal, it's pretty significant, unfortunately, but it's true, right? And I can't imagine the pressure traveling that much and stuff they were under, right? So that's significant. I think it would be interesting what would have happened had Schaeffer had the time to age like Graham did, right? Because Graham eventually had to face some of his own stuff, right? The Nixon tapes. Like, he lived long enough to have to face that and lived long enough to say, I made some mistakes. Schaeffer really didn't. He was kind of in the midst of his action when he passed away. So there's something to think about there.
And they were pretty much contemporaries. I mean, they were born.
Yeah, I think Schaeffer was born in 1912 and Graham was 1918.
Yeah, so essentially.
Right, but Graham lived till just a year or two ago, and Schaeffer died in 84. Like, think about that, you know, the way in which you could kind of do something.
Even personality, like Graham's a Southerner, and Schaeffer's a Germantown Philadelphian.
Right.
There's something about even the way they communicated.
Well, and if you get into that kind of stuff too, it's super interesting. Like, they both married these really like genteel missionary daughters, right? Who like were very much more cultured than the men, the farmer Graham or the Germantown laborer's son, you know. And I mean, would Graham or Schaeffer have happened without the women in their lives? I think not, you know.
Yeah. Well, we'll move from women's influence and importance to race. So what can we learn from Schaeffer about America and our race problem, divide, horror, sin?
Yeah. Well, you know, Schaeffer was creating an integrated space of Labrie the whole time, you know, and so like Sylvester Jacobs is a case in point, and he's one of the most well-known. But, you know, he gets a one-way ticket to Europe. He is leaving racist America. Young black man leaving in the late 60s. He's out of there. And he finds himself at L'Abri, and he falls in love with the place. And he falls in love, again, with God. He falls in love with the Schaeffers. And we were just talking about his book of photos. He puts that love into photos.
There's 2 of them downstairs. Please check them out. Let me just say, I have an extra one. Make the case that you really want it and need it. I'll give it to you tonight. I'm serious.
There you
Not
go.
online, live. But there's two copies of this very rare book of his plates from the 70s of L'Abri.
Yeah, it's
Carry on.
beautiful. It's beautiful.
Carry on.
It's a large book IVP published in 73. So, yeah, Jacobs, I think his book is called Born Black. It's a small paperback that he published about this time in the early 70s, I think. You know, he basically tells the story of finding Christianity at L'Abri in a way that it wasn't, he didn't experience it in America. And so I think Schaeffer was doing, at least within the sphere of L'Abri, what he had to do. I mean, it's always one of the things you can read back. Could he have done more? Yeah. But people that were there felt it, felt the kind of way in which a person's skin didn't equate to their value and didn't say anything about it. That Schaeffer could look beyond that and look at their heart, but also see that and see their story. So it was important.
Yeah.
L'Abri was really an international place.
It was. I met, and the way that he wrote, the things he wrote about, influenced someone like my friend Stan Morton. He's in Richmond now. He used to be a pastor here in Lancaster, and I met him standing in line to talk to Jerem Bars at a conference here in Lancaster in '92. And I'm waiting to talk to Jerem Bars, who I eventually studied with. And behind me was this African-American guy that we got to talking, and he was eager to talk to Jerem, and come to find out that Stan read Schaeffer and was like, this guy gets it. And one of the things that Schaeffer said, now imagine this, late 70s, he writes a book called The Church at the End of the 20th Century. And one of the things he said, I think, actually rattled Stan and made him pay attention to Schaeffer. You know, Schaeffer's saying, we're having race issues in our country. Okay, and we're troubled about the cities and, the riots. How many of you, when's the last time you've had someone different from you, of another race, particularly black, in your home for dinner? And he was calling out the American church in the 70s, saying, we're not going to see any change till we change. And that resonated with Stan. And he considers Schaeffer a great hero, The potential was there, even though maybe more could have been done. But anything else? Yeah.
It feels
Last
like
one.
culture might be a little more individualistic now, or heading in that direction. Do you feel like it's more of a challenge to create a community like L'Abri in the current cultural climate that we have?
Yeah, definitely. You might think with social media and stuff, we'll get more people there, whatever. But yeah, people aren't willing to commit to a heck of a lot. And it is interesting. So there are studies, and if you think about it, a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people that went to L'Abri are on this kind of gap year journey. They're hiking through Europe, when hiking through Europe was something you did. So like one of my mentors is a guy named Scott Sundquist. He's now the president of Gordon Conwell. He tried to find L'Abri hiking through Europe in the 60s and he couldn't find it. It was in such a small town, he couldn't find it. But like people went there just hiking through, right? And I think it was this is the era where people just said, I'm going to go find the truth. I'm going to go to India. I'm going to go to the East. I'm going to go to Europe and backpack around and just show up and hitchhike my way. And so there was something about the rootedness in place. And what's interesting is the study centers that come after L'Abri, and many of them, like I said, blend Regent and L'Abri, but they have a lot of this hospitality. So when they build the study center at UVA, they put fireplaces in almost every room so it can be like L'Abri. And they have this hospitality. They build a big, big kitchen so they can have food. But like many of them, at 1977, there's a shift, and there's these studies, longitudinal studies of college students, and in 77, it shifts from I go to college to like learn more about the world and become a better person to I go to college to make more money. And when those lines cross, and they never cross back again, like people start taking way less time for gap years. So the places like Regent and L'Abri, who were there in the 60s, and in the early 70s, when people were really like, I'm just going to find myself, I'm going to go do this, I'm going to take time off from, this might not help me make any money at all, but I'm going to do it. They thrive. The ones that came a little later and didn't get enough momentum through that, they struggled. They struggle a lot more.
Wow. And we mentioned L'Abri a lot, so if anybody out there wants to know more about it, go to L'Abri.org. EnglishL'Abri.org is where Beck and I have gone, and you can check it out and see for yourself. And we commend them to you if you have questions or just want to experience some community. You do give up a lot when you go to L'Abri still this day, but people go willingly, keep their phones over here, and they try to create as much community. It's still possible. And it may be lots of little ways that's still happening. It can happen. It starts small. It really does start small. So really appreciate you guys all being here tonight. And please, if you're in the room, come down and see Charlie and let him sign a book. And tell me if you want that L'Abri book. There's a bunch of, Ethan made a stack of all these Schaeffer books that were just on my shelf, just random books. You can see just some of the things that they have contributed. From Francis and Edith, yeah. So my little art piece in honor of them downstairs. But let's hear it again for Charlie and thank him. And thanks for coming. Help yourself to whatever food is down there. Hang around in the gallery.